As we all do, I read many texts concurrently, and I have found great resonance providing both beauty and truth between two. Let me tell you about each. The first is a slim, elegant volume, George Johnson's The 10 Most Beautiful Experiments. Here is science writing at its best as Johnson captures those rare moments when, using materials at hand, a curious soul figured out a way to pose a question to the universe and persisted until it replied. From his treatment of Galileo's passion to find out how things really move, to Millikan's tenacious efforts to detect an electron, Johnson describes for us a series of experiments that fashion the way we understand the world. The second text is a document entitled Guidelines for Constructed Response and Other Performance Assessments, prepared by Doug Baldwin, Mary Fowles, and Skip Livingston of the Educational Testing Service. In the field of educational measurement, these constructed response guidelines are a testament to state-of-the-art best practices for planning, designing, administering, and evaluating an assessment so that validity evidence may be expertly and responsibly accumulated. Metaphorically, it is a world that assumes, as it should, that electrons exist. Educational research analogous to Millikan's oil drop experiment, snatching and calculating the charge of isolated variables, is not recalled. Now, my own recent text is a history of writing assessment, and in it I attempt to document those rare moments when curious souls discovered ways to pose questions about what it is we do when we take fluid ideas to blank paper, and how others can get at what appeared there. When I read the ETS Guidelines, I wanted to grab a blank sheet and annotate the guidelines' origins. In the introduction, for example, we find the advice that those designing tests should make relevant information about the assessment available during the developmental stages so that those who need to know, such as sponsoring agencies, and those who wish to know, such as parents, can comment on this information. Number 2 pencil in hand, I began to jot down notes about ETS's Samuel Messick and his concern, expressed most faithfully in his 1989 chapter on validity for the 3rd edition of Educational Measurement, with consequences of test use, not only as part of score meaning, but as a basis for social action. Indeed, it is correct to say that Messick's insistence on considering the consequences of test use drove the recent conceptual shift to term our verification processes validation, as they're now called in the 2006 4th edition of Educational Measurement. Receding, thus, are these concretized products of validity present now, or procedural validation arguments. And further down the page of the Constructed Response Guidelines, we find definitions of key terms, task and response, rubric and scores. Those terms, so casually self-evident there on the page, were so very hard-won. While the College Board in 1900 had launched a post-secondary admissions venture, the assessment of writing ability was nearly shipwrecked in 1945 as Edward Noyes, William Sale, and John Stalnaker came to the conclusion that it was difficult to see how any more could be done to improve the scoring of essays, a process that continued to fail in inter-reader reliability measures. How to provide a conceptual and historical gloss to these important ETS guidelines. How to suggest, for example, that on pages 15 to 18 of the guidelines, scoring the responses have a rich, compelling history in which ETS itself played the leading role. The answer was clear. Borrow the idea from George Johnson of selecting instances of experimentation that were conducted with such straightforward elegance that they deserve to be called beautiful. So here's the question. What might be identified as the 3 most beautiful experiments at ETS in the assessment of writing ability? My candidate for the first most beautiful experiment is that performed by Fred Gottschall, Francis Swineford, and William E. Kaufman in the early 1960s. The period leading up to their experiment might rightly be called the darkest period in writing assessment. Not only had Noyes, Sale, and Stalnaker declared to the post-World War II educational community that essay scoring was foundering, but an effort to develop a general composition test had played out very badly and very publicly in the pages of the 1955 College Board Review. The assessment of writing ability, readers were told, was part of the landscape of the immeasurable. Then, along came Fred Gottschall, a former classroom teacher and head of the ETS Humanities Department, Francis Swineford, a student of factor analysis pioneer Carl Holzinger and head of the ETS test analysis section. In an internally proposed memo dated October 2, 1961, they argued that they could design a structured free response test with control scoring of high reliability. The free response writing sample will be scored, and here's the breakthrough concept, holistically. Group consensus would be reached to prompt successful ratings of individual papers, and the elements that had been considered in arriving at that conclusion would be articulated during the group consensus training period. Both William Kaufman and John French, other ETS researchers, had worked to identify elements of writing ability. Yet the striking idea behind the Godshaw and Swineford proposal was to ensure high reliability by employing the principles underlying Gestalt psychology, to foster an emphasis on emergent wholes of writing samples, to concentrate on the phenomenological, immediate, and impressionistic experience of reading student papers, and to realize the usefulness of seeing the elements of writing ability as constituting those emergent writing performances. A draft of the research was completed in 1961, and the final monograph, The Measurement of Writing Ability, was published in 1966. The student writing samples, the monograph reported, were the criterion measure for the study, a bold strategic move that put direct assessment center stage. The reliabilities attained were well above average, and the total essay reliability, 0.919, was remarkable. In the final chapter of the monograph, Godshaw, Swineford, and Kaufman brought the point home. The essay, they concluded, was now certified for regular use to evaluate writing ability. Due to ETS experimental advances, the modern era of writing assessment had begun. Here was willingness to place writing itself at the center of research and to judge it holistically, thus setting aside rule-based elementalist views of writing. My candidate for the second most beautiful experiment is that performed by Hunter M. Breland and his colleagues in 1984. This study, Linear Models of Writing Assessments, is significant for its forward-thinking conceptual orientation. Building on that Gestalt-oriented concept of holisticism, Breland observed that clinical judgments in psychology are in many ways similar to expert judgments of writing samples. How, he wondered, would this clinical perspective impact judgment? The second objective of the study, improved efficiency, was thought through what he termed, and here's that breakthrough concept, Cottage scoring processes. Could researchers working remotely, he wondered, produce scores as reliable and valid as those produced by readers in a conference setting? The linear models confirm the importance of seeing writing as a complex cognitive activity, in which sentence and word patterns matter. The most valid models were those based on focused ratings of three key aspects of writing samples: discourse quality, syntactic quality, lexical quality. The least valid models were based on checklist ratings, atomistic, elementalist qualities. Breland and his associates had introduced complexity as a significant element to be accounted for in the writing products of students. As well, the experiment in Cottage scoring was effective. Reliabilities for essays scored remotely were higher than the reading reliabilities obtained for essays scored in traditional conference settings. The cost per essay scored at a conference setting was $1.70. The cost of remote scoring was only 89 cents. Technological developments of recent years now make such scoring arrangements possible, Breland concluded in 1984, and the analysis demonstrate that remote judgments can be made that are more reliable than present conference arrangements. In a single experiment, Breland had confirmed that writing is a discourse-centered act, not a rule-governed, penny-pinching form of grammatically based accountancy. As well, his use of the term cottage and his discovery of the spun goal that may be found in local settings demonstrates that the coldness and isolation of the then-emerging computer age need not be that at all. Rather, as Susan Keller said in her 1978 foreword to the first edition of Network Nation by Starr, Roxanne Hiltz, and Murray Toroff, computers held the potential to become a source of a special and new form of human community. Due to ETS experimental advances, the modern era of writing assessment had continued, now embracing a more complex view of writing and a willingness to let machines into the garden, and the nonprofit organization's willingness to embrace contingency. After all, little was known about remote scoring of essays in 1984. It may be said that ETS had entered into the world of the postmodern. My candidate for the third most beautiful experiment is that performed by Jill Bernstein and her colleagues in the field of automated essay scoring. Trained in linguistics at the City University of New York, Princeton had worked at the Borough of Manhattan Community College with English as a second language learners. When she came to ETS, she and her colleagues began studying the rubrics used to assess writing. What she wondered was there in those rubrics that could be captured computationally so that essay scoring could be automated. Using 5 predictive variables designed to give as full a play as possible to rhetorical and structural features of writing, she and her colleagues had designed an automated essay system that could predict exact or adjacent scores with as high as 95% agreement with human raters. The new system, termed E-Rater, had operationalized a vigorous understanding of writing assessment that had begun with the Gottschall, Kaufman, and Swineford studies some 37 years before. In referencing the writing assessment work of Breland, Bernstein was operating in the rich ETS tradition of giving full play to the construct of writing ability. The breakthrough concepts? The design of the automated system to embrace complex elements of written products, and the willingness to see reliability not as a pursuit in and of itself, but instead as part of the validation process. Now, I don't want to give the impression that ETS was hosting all the most beautiful experiments, its researchers having all the fun all by themselves. Across the nation, researchers were working on their own beautiful experiments that were regularly incorporated into ETS experimental designs. In a truly beautiful 1979 experiment, Sandra Pearl of the City University of New York collected student essays, protocol tapes made as students were composing those essays, and interview responses. She found that post-secondary basic writers are not beginners at all, but rather that they are those who have deeply embedded composing processes that are, at the end of the day, ineffective. Effective writing instruction, Pearl discovered, must attend to process as well as product. In a subsequently beautiful experiment building on Pearl's, Linda Flower and John R. Hayes at Carnegie Mellon University used 5 years' work with protocol analysis to develop a cognitive process theory of writing in 1981. The theory helped to structure our current understanding of writing as a construct involving distinct thinking processes, which writers orchestrate during the act of composing, an act in which processes have a hierarchical, highly embedded organization. The act of composing, their research led us to understand, is itself a goal-directed thinking process. As a result, writers create their own goals as they develop their own sense of purpose. 2, there's the famous experiment of the design of writing assessment tasks, conducted by Sandra Murphy, Leo Ruth, and James Gray, and their West Coast University colleagues. Under a grant from the National Institute of Education, these researchers investigated the impact of writing tasks on students. Their understanding led to the design of a model for writing assessment episode in which the dynamic, interactive relationships of participants, processes, and texts comprise the total assessment event. The work of these researchers on designing writing assessment tasks for the assessment of writing is my candidate for the Academy's third most beautiful experiment. 3 beautiful academic experiments, each reflecting earlier advances, each acknowledging what George Johnson terms the elegance of design and execution, the cleanliness of the lines of thought. Across the nation, university researchers were working concurrently, often collaborating with ETS researchers, to deepen our understanding of writing in the assessment. In closing, I want to offer a 4th most beautiful experiment at ETS, one that accounts for the traditions of Gottschall, Swineford, Kaufman, Breland, and Bernstein, of Pearl, Flower, Hayes, Murphy, Ruth, and Gray. My candidate for the next most beautiful experiment in writing assessment is the Seaball Writing Initiative. The cognitively based assessment of, for, and as learning, an internal ETS research initiative, adopts a knowledge-transforming approach to the construct of writing, thus embracing a competency model designed to identify explicitly student basic language and literacy skills, strategic management of the writing process, and applied critical thinking. The use of E-Rater in the project allows rapid and detailed feedback, thereby making tests more instructionally useful while containing costs. And so here it is, the merging of writing assessment efforts both within and beyond ETS, an effort that embraces what we have collaboratively discovered, working both within and beyond ETS over the past 4 decades in this engaging and ever-emerging field. The Seaball Writing Assessment Project allows the construct of writing full engagement, thus yielding a potential for assessment that could literally reify a much-needed broad accountability assessment and localized instruction. At a time in which perfect storms are forming that are ominous in their potential to interrupt both economic and educational agendas, such a radical reconceptualization of writing assessment is a worthy candidate for the fourth most beautiful experiment. For writing assessment, like writing itself, requires an engagement with complexity. It is work that is challenging to get right, no matter how hard we try. In such a situation, robust construct representation requires extraordinary diligence, because the more we know, the more we must account for as we seek to operational ideas and performance assessments. Experimental design is critical, as is the tenacity and humility of the researchers. Yet while such work is often so very demanding, it is always so very rewarding. What we do in assessment holds the potential to help fashion a new environment in which collaboration results in increased benefits for students and their teachers, those forever at the center of our efforts because therein rests our common future. ETS is, and always has been, a faithful partner on this winding road. For my part, I just can't wait to see what path ETS will take next.